She was 72 years old and had spent 35 years cutting and soldering stained glass with her bare hands. When her husband died, her daughter-in-law called the meeting. The house went, the savings went, the car went. When everything was divided, they slid one last document across the table without looking at it. An abandoned cannery in a town called Copperfield, buried in back taxes, cited twice by code enforcement, worth nothing to anyone. She took it. She arrived alone on a Tuesday morning and opened a door that had not been opened in 30 years. What she found in the back room of that cannery stopped her breathing. Her daughter-in-law drove to Copperfield 9 months later and stood in the middle of it and could not find a single word. But I need to take you back to the beginning. June Alcott had a way of understanding light that most people spend their whole lives without developing. Not in any abstract or artistic sense, in a practical and specific sense. The sense of a woman who had spent 35 years learning what light does when you put glass in its path. How it bends, how it warms, how the impurities in old glass scatter it differently from new glass, turning flat illumination into something with temperature and weight, and the particular quality of being somewhere rather than just being bright. She had started with her grandmother's tools at 19 years old, a glass cutter, a soldering iron, a light table built from plywood and salvaged fluorescent tubes in a workshop that smelled like flux and sawdust. Her grandmother had made windows for churches in 3 counties and had taught June with the specific patience of someone passing something on rather than simply instructing. "You are not cutting glass," her grandmother told her. "You are deciding where the light goes." That distinction had stayed with June for 53 years and had shaped every panel she ever made. She worked on churches and municipal buildings and private commissions. She worked on a hospital chapel in 1981 that still held its original panels. She worked on a courthouse rotunda in 94 that people stopped to look up at on their way to and from things that mattered to them. She worked until her hands began aching in the cold and her husband Wallace needed her closer to home. And then she stopped. She was 65 years old and she set down her glass cutter and did not pick it up again. But the knowledge stayed in her hands, the way knowledge does when it has been practiced long enough to become part of the body rather than the mind. Wallace painted for 50 years. He was not famous. He had shown once at a small gallery when he was 43 and sold 2 pieces and said that was enough exposure for 1 lifetime and meant it. He painted in the back room of their house on Clement Street every evening after dinner, landscapes mostly, the quality of light on water and on stone and on the faces of people doing ordinary things. June had lived beside that work for decades and loved it without fully understanding it, because you cannot always see clearly what is directly in front of you every day of your life. You get used to it. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition, which is one of the quiet tragedies of long marriage and also one of its graces. Wallace died on a Wednesday morning in March. He was sitting in his reading chair by the back room door with a cup of tea still warm beside him, and June found him when the tea had gone cold and understood immediately and completely. She sat with him for a while before she called anyone. She did not know why she sat there. She simply could not make herself leave the room. In the weeks that followed, she carried one thing everywhere she went: his last painting, the one that had been on the easel in the back room when he died. A panel roughly the size of a hardback book, showing the quality of morning light on still water, unfinished in the top right corner where his hand had simply stopped. She carried it in her bag without being able to explain why. Some things you carry because putting them down has never felt right. 6 weeks after the funeral, Renee called a meeting. Her daughter-in-law was 44 years old and ran a property management company with the specific efficiency of someone who approaches every situation as a problem requiring a solution and has developed considerable skill at finding solutions that work out well for herself. She was not obviously unkind. She had never said a cruel word to June in 11 years of marriage to Gerard. She had simply treated June the way certain people treat things that are in the way, with a patience that was really impatience wearing a polite expression, waiting for the situation to resolve itself into something more convenient. Gerard was 47 and worked in insurance and had the quality of someone who has spent his adult life choosing the path of least resistance and calling it practicality. He sat beside his wife at their dining room table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the space between his hands for most of the conversation. June had raised this man. She had packed his lunches and driven him to practice and sat with him through every difficult thing his childhood produced. She watched him now and looked for the boy she had raised inside the man who would not meet her eyes, and found him, still there, smaller than he used to be. Renee had a folder. She opened it and spread the documents across the table with the practiced ease of someone who is prepared thoroughly and wants the preparation to show. The house on Clement Street had been placed in Gerard's name 8 years ago through an estate planning arrangement that June and Wallace had agreed to without reading the details carefully enough. It had seemed reasonable at the time. Things seem reasonable when the person explaining them uses the right vocabulary, and you have spent 38 years trusting the people around you. Renee said this without apology because she did not consider it something that required one. The house was in Gerard's name. The paperwork was clear. She moved on. The joint savings account had been moved into a trust she and Gerard administered jointly. She said this was for estate management purposes. She said it the way people use language when they want to make a decision sound like a process, as though the outcome had been produced by the situation rather than by her. The car was needed for her commute. Her own vehicle had become unreliable. June watched Gerard's hands while Renee talked. His fingers pressed hard into the table once, briefly. The kind of pressure a person exerts when something lands in them that they have decided not to let show. Then his hands flattened and stayed flat, and he looked at the space between them and did not look at his mother for the remainder of the conversation. That single pressing was the most honest thing in the room. June asked what was left. Renee slid a document across the table without looking at it. The specific gesture of someone handing over something they have already decided is worthless, not with carelessness exactly, but with the absence of attention that comes from having already moved on in your mind. A deed. Wallace's father's old cannery property in a small town called Copperfield, 40 miles north, assessed below its outstanding back taxes, cited twice by county code enforcement, a building nobody had been inside in 30 years. She said they had decided to let June keep it since it was technically part of Wallace's estate, and June was the primary beneficiary. She said it with the flat generosity of someone giving away something that costs them nothing. June picked up the document and folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. She also picked up the unfinished canvas from the table in front of her. She had brought it with her without thinking, the way she brought it everywhere. She put it in her coat pocket beside the deed. She thanked her son and his wife and stood up and walked to the door and let herself out. She sat in the parking lot for a moment before she started the car. The car she would no longer have after Tuesday. She sat and looked at the steering wheel and did not immediately start the engine. She thought about Wallace's hands pressing paint across canvas for 50 years in the back room of a house that was no longer hers. She thought about Gerard's hands pressing flat against a dining room table and releasing and staying flat, and how that single movement had told her more than anything said in that room. She thought about her own hands in her lap, the hands that had cut glass for 35 years, and that still knew exactly what they were capable of, even after 7 years of not being asked to prove it. She had spent her whole working life deciding where the light goes. Her grandmother had told her that was what the work was. Not cutting glass, not soldering lead, deciding where the light goes. She started the car. She drove home and she packed one bag carefully, and she left the rest where it was, because what she needed had never been in the furniture or the curtains or the things that filled the rooms. What she needed she had been carrying in her hands for 53 years, and she was not leaving it behind. She packed the camp stove, her tools wrapped in cloth, her medication, her coat, and the unfinished canvas, which she placed on top of everything else in the bag because it was the last thing she wanted to reach for, and also the first. She took a bus to Copperfield 3 days later with $29 and one bag. The town was small and flat, the kind of place where you could stand at one end of the main street and see the other end clearly. A hardware store, a diner, a post office, a church. The bus dropped her at the gas station on the edge of town, and she walked the remaining mile to the cannery with her bag over her shoulder and the unfinished canvas in her coat pocket, and the deed in the other pocket, and $29 between her and everything that came next. The cannery sat at the edge of town, where the old river had been redirected decades ago, a long, low brick building with a rusted metal roof and loading dock doors that had not opened in 30 years. The brickwork was solid. The roof was rusted but intact. The windows along the south wall were large industrial panes in heavy steel frames, each one thick and slightly greenish with age, the specific green of old glass that has absorbed decades of light and holds it differently from new glass. June stopped when she saw those windows. She stood on the gravel outside the cannery and looked at the south wall windows for a long time. The afternoon light was coming through them at an angle that produced the particular quality of diffusion that old glass creates, warm and slightly amber, the kind of light that painters spend their whole careers chasing and rarely find indoors. She pressed her palm flat against the brick wall beside the nearest window frame and stood there for a moment. Then she pushed open the door and went inside. The interior was vast and cold and smelled like concrete and old metal and time. The floor was poured concrete, level and sound. Industrial steel shelving units ran along the north and east walls, rusted but structurally intact. Debris covered most surfaces, but the south wall was alive. The afternoon light coming through the industrial panes fell across the concrete floor in broad, warm sheets that moved slowly as the sun moved, changing angle and quality as the afternoon progressed, and June walked into one of those sheets of light and stood in it and felt something move in her hands that she had not felt in 7 years. She understood in that moment something she had not fully understood in 35 years of marriage to Wallace. He had not been painting light in the abstract. He had been painting the specific quality of light that comes through old glass, the warmth of it, the diffusion, the way it carries color without announcing it, the way it makes a room feel inhabited rather than illuminated. He had spent 50 years painting what she spent 35 years making. They had been working with the same material from different sides, without either of them ever saying so, or perhaps without either of them knowing. She pressed her palm against the steel frame of the nearest window and held it there. Then she went to find the back room. The steel door at the far end of the north wall required a pry bar she found in the loading dock. It took her 20 minutes and both hands and the full weight of her body against the bar before the hinges gave. Behind the door was a room she had not expected. Concrete on all 4 sides, thick walls, no exterior exposure, completely sealed from the weather and from the temperature fluctuations of the main space. The air inside was cool and dry and still, and stacked against every wall, floor to ceiling, wrapped in canvas and tied with twine, with the careful deliberateness of someone who intended them to be found in good condition, were paintings. She counted them twice. 43, each one wrapped, each one tied, each one bearing a small paper label in Wallace's careful handwriting. Date, title, nothing else. The earliest label read 1971, The most recent read 4 months before his death. June opened the nearest one and looked at what was inside. She sat down on the concrete floor. The painting was extraordinary, not in any way that required expertise to recognize, in the way that something genuinely good is recognizable to any person with eyes and time enough to look at it properly. The light in it was the light she had been standing in 20 minutes ago in the main room of the cannery. He had painted this specific quality of light, the warm, diffuse amber of old glass in afternoon. He had painted it and stored it here and told no one. She opened 3 more. Each one as good as the last, each one a different angle on the same obsession with light. Light on water, light on stone, light through leaves, light on the face of a woman working at a table, seen from behind, the light falling across her shoulders and her hands. June looked at that last one for a long time, then she turned it over. On the back of the canvas, in pencil, small and written with the careful hand of someone marking something that belongs to someone, was her name, June. She turned over the next canvas. June, the next, June. She turned over every canvas in the room, all 43, and every single one had her name written on the back in Wallace's pencil, not on the labels, on the canvas itself. Some of them were faded, written 40 years ago. Some were fresh, written months before he died. 50 years of work addressed to her without her knowledge, without a word, without a single evening in the back room of the house on Clement Street, where he said, "Here, this is yours. I have been making this for you." June sat on the concrete floor of the sealed-back room of an abandoned cannery in a town called Copperfield, with 43 of her husband's paintings around her, and the unfinished canvas in her lap, and her own name in pencil on the back of every one of them, and she stayed there for a very long time. She thought about 38 years of marriage, about the evenings she had spent in the front room while Wallace painted in the back room, reading or mending or simply sitting with the sound of him working through the wall, the specific comfort of being near someone you love without being in the same room, which is a comfort you only understand after it is gone. She thought about every time she had stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at what he was working on, and told him it was beautiful and watched him shake his head with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided the verdict before hearing the evidence. She thought about the fact that he had been storing this work here for decades, driving to Copperfield alone, carrying canvases wrapped in cloth, stacking them in this sealed room with her name written on the back of each one, and then driving home and eating dinner and sitting in his chair by the window and never saying a single word about it, not because he was hiding something from her, because he was keeping something for her, because in the specific grammar of Wallace's love, keeping was the word for what other people meant when they said giving. She looked at the unfinished canvas in her lap, the quality of morning light on still water, the top right corner where his hand had stopped. She thought that she understood now why she had been carrying it. Some things are not finished because the person who started them ran out of time. Some things are not finished because they were always meant to be completed by someone else. She did not know yet what completing it meant. She did not know if it meant painting the corner or simply hanging it as it was, the unfinished part of it as honest as everything else he had made. She did not know. But she understood now that she was the one who was going to decide. She stayed on the concrete floor until the light through the south wall windows had moved from afternoon gold to the flat pale gray of early evening, the light changing in the way that light in old glass always changes, slowly and completely, one quality giving way to another without announcement. Then she went to find somewhere to sleep and came back in the morning with her tools. Philomena came on the 3rd day, She was a retired art teacher who had walked past the cannery every morning for 30 years on her way to and from things, and who stopped on the third morning because the south wall windows were lit from inside, and they had not been lit from inside in 30 years. She knocked, and June opened the door, and Philomena looked not at the windows and not at the space, but at June's hands. At the way June was holding the glass cutter she had bought at Bart's hardware store that morning to assess the condition of the window panes. With the specific, relaxed precision of someone for whom a glass cutter is an extension of the hand rather than a tool being operated. She said, "You know what you are doing with that." June said she had spent 35 years with glass. Philomena looked at June for a moment. Then she said she had a ladder in her garage and would come back tomorrow morning if that was useful. June said it would be very useful. She came back the next morning and every morning after that. She was 70 years old and had taught art for 32 years and had strong opinions about light and no patience for anything that wasted it. She held the ladder and passed tools and made observations about the window frames that were accurate and worth hearing, and she brought coffee in a thermos every morning because she had noticed that June's camp stove produced coffee that was adequate but not good. Bart, at the hardware store, had noticed June's hands on her first visit. He watched her examine a glass cutter for 30 seconds before she selected it, and he extended her a line of credit without being asked, and without discussing it, the way people extend things to other people when they recognize something that does not need explaining. Petra arrived in the 6th week. She was 23 years old and 4 months from having a child, and had been living in her car since her landlord sold the building she had been renting and gave her 30 days' notice with nowhere to go and no family in the state to turn to. She had been managing with the specific resourcefulness of someone who has been in difficult situations long enough to stop being surprised by them, sleeping in her car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner where the staff let her use the bathroom in the mornings without saying anything about it. She had heard about the cannery from Bart, who had heard about it from the woman at the post office, in the way that information travels in small towns, not through announcement or organization, but through the slow accumulation of observation and conversation across counters and over coffee. She arrived on a Tuesday morning with one bag and the careful self-possession of someone who has decided that asking for help is not the same as giving up. She asked if there was something useful she could do. She did not offer qualifications. She did not explain herself or try to make herself sound more useful than she was. She simply stood in the doorway of the cannery with the morning light behind her and asked, and June looked at her standing there and stepped aside. June showed her the storage room and the wrapped canvases and the documentation notebook and asked if she could build a proper inventory. Petra looked at the room for a moment, at the rows of wrapped canvases stacked to the ceiling, and then she opened the nearest one and looked at what was inside for a long time without speaking. Then she turned it over and saw the name on the back. She looked at June. She said nothing. She picked up the notebook from the shelf and sat down on the concrete floor and began writing. She did not ask what the name meant. She did not ask why it was there. She simply recorded it in the inventory alongside the date and the title and the condition of the canvas and moved to the next one. That was the moment June trusted her completely. Not because Petra had been useful, though she had been, but because she had understood, without being told, that some things you encounter and document and do not diminish with questions that can wait. Otto had been sleeping in the loading dock for a week before June found him. He was 16 years old, lean and watchful, with the specific stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible because taking up space had historically cost him something. He had left a foster placement that had not been safe and had been moving between towns for 2 months. June found him on a Wednesday morning curled in the corner of the loading dock with a backpack, and she did not ask him to explain himself or to leave. She made breakfast on the camp stove and set it in front of him without comment. He ate everything on the plate. Then he looked up at the south wall windows from where he was sitting and said he had never seen glass that color before. June said it was old glass. She said old glass had impurities in it that new glass did not, and that those impurities were what made the light come through warm instead of flat. Otto looked at the windows for another moment. Then he looked at June and said he wanted to learn how to do that. June handed him a glass cutter. She showed him the grip first, the specific angle of the wrist that lets the cutter follow a line without fighting the glass. She showed him how to score without pressing too hard, how to listen to the sound the cutter made and let the sound tell him whether the pressure was right. She showed him how to break along the score line cleanly, the specific tap and flex that separates glass without shattering it. He was careful and focused, and he asked good questions, and he learned faster than anyone she had taught except herself. By the end of the second month, the cannery was becoming something. June had restored the south wall windows entirely, replacing 7 cracked panes with glass sourced from a salvage yard 40 miles away, cutting and fitting each piece herself, with Otto assisting and learning as he went. The work took 3 weeks and required a patience that June had in abundance, and that Otto developed quickly once he understood that glass does not forgive impatience, that you cannot rush a score line or force a break, that the material tells you when it is ready, and your job is to listen. By the end of the 3rd week, he was cutting curves that would have been difficult work for someone twice his age. The light that came through the restored windows was different from what had been there before. Not brighter exactly, cleaner. The impurities in the old glass were preserved, but the distortions from the cracked and hazed sections were gone, and the result was the specific quality of light that June had understood since she was 19 years old in her grandmother's workshop. Warm and diffuse and present in a way that flat illumination never quite manages. The kind of light that makes a room feel inhabited rather than simply lit. June cleaned and sealed the concrete floors until the light moved across them the way it moved across water. She had cleared the north and east shelving and refinished the steel with a rust converter and a coat of flat black paint that Bart sourced for her at cost. She had repaired the loading dock doors with new hardware so they opened smoothly in good weather, letting in air and the particular sound of a small town going about its morning, which turned out to be a sound she had not known she had missed until she heard it again every day. She had built display fixtures from salvaged timber, simple and solid, designed to hold work at eye level in the best of the south wall light, each one checked for level by Philomena, who had a small spirit level in her coat pocket that she carried the way some people carry rosary beads. The 43 paintings had been documented by Petra across 3 weeks of careful work, catalogued and cross-referenced against the journal she had found on the backroom workbench. A small spiral-bound book that turned out to be a complete record of every painting Wallace had ever made, every date and title, and a note about the quality of light he had been trying to capture in each one. Reading the journal alongside the paintings was like hearing a conversation that had been happening for 50 years in a room she had never been allowed to enter. He had been trying to say something all that time. He had simply been saying it in a language she had not known he was speaking. On the evening that all 4 of them sat together at the table, June had built near the loading dock doors, eating supper with the last of the day's light coming gold through the south wall, and the paintings hung, and exactly where they should be. June looked at Philomena and Petra and Otto, and then at the unfinished canvas on the small shelf near the door where she had placed it on the first morning so it caught the light, and she made the decision she had been moving toward since she sat on the concrete floor with 43 canvases and her name written on the back of everyone. She was going to show them. If you have made it this far into June's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The code enforcement notice arrived the following week. The work June had done had triggered a reassessment. The cannery was not listed for residential use and did not meet occupancy standards. 30 days to comply or vacate. Bart mobilized the way First Allies mobilize when something they have been quietly supporting is threatened, not dramatically, but completely. An electrician came. A plumber came. Philomena called 3 former students who arrived on a Saturday with tools and spent the weekend working. Otto helped with everything and learned as he went and was more useful than anyone expected, including Otto himself. The inspector arrived on a Wednesday morning expecting a ruin. He walked through a gallery. He stood in the south wall light for a long moment before he opened his clipboard. He looked up at the windows, at the quality of the light coming through the restored old glass, and then down at the paintings on the walls, and then at June, standing to one side, watching him. He said he had not seen light like this inside a building in 20 years of doing this work. He signed the compliance certificate and left. Philomena had a former student at the Regional Arts Foundation. She made one phone call on a Thursday afternoon. The foundation sent a curator named Diana, who drove 2 hours and spent 4 hours in the back room, opening wrapped canvases and making notes in a small leather book and saying almost nothing. She came out and sat at the table near the loading dock doors and looked at June and was quiet for a moment that had a specific weight in it. Then she said that Wallace Alcott had spent 50 years making work that needed to be seen. June asked what the collection was worth. Diana looked at her notes. She said she could not give a final number without full authentication and provenance documentation, but that based on the volume and quality and the consistency of the work across 5 decades, the collection was conservatively valued at $1.4 million and possibly significantly more depending on market response. June sat with that number. She thought about Wallace, shaking his head at every compliment she had given him across 38 years of marriage. She thought about the evenings in the back room of the house on Clement Street. She thought about her name in pencil on the back of 43 canvases in a sealed room that nobody had opened in 30 years. She said she wanted to open a gallery. Diana said she wanted to help. The exhibition opened on a Friday evening 6 weeks later. The south wall light had been supplemented with professional gallery lighting that the foundation arranged, warm and precisely directed, falling across the paintings the way June had intended when she first looked at those industrial windows and felt something move in her hands. 200 people came on opening night. A collector from the city bought 4 paintings before the evening was over. A journalist from a national arts publication drove to Copperfield the following week and wrote about the widow who had found her late husband's hidden life's work in an abandoned cannery and restored the building herself, using 35 years of stained glass expertise. The story was shared extensively. The cannery had more visitors the following weekend than Copperfield had seen in any single weekend in a decade. Renee saw the coverage on a Sunday morning. She arrived at the cannery the following Saturday. She parked in the gravel lot and sat in her car for a long time before she came inside. The cannery was open, people moving through the space, and she walked through it slowly, reading the small cards beside each painting, looking at the prices, looking at the quality of the light, looking at everything with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere expecting one thing and encountered something completely different. June was near the loading dock doors when she saw Renee come in. She did not go to meet her. She waited. Renee found her eventually. She stood in front of June with the controlled expression she had worn at the dining room table 11 months ago, but something in the light or the paintings or the people moving through the space had unsettled the control slightly, loosened it at the edges. She said she had not known about the paintings. June said she knew that. Renee said she thought perhaps they should discuss the estate, that, since the collection had been Wallace's property, certain questions arose about the proceeds, and that her lawyer had suggested it might be worth discussing how things should be handled going forward. June looked at her daughter-in-law. She looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then she said that the cannery and everything in it had been left to her in Wallace's will, and that the relevant documents were available to any lawyer Renee chose to engage. She said that the house on Clement Street and the savings account and the car had been taken from her through paperwork she had trusted her son and his wife to handle fairly. She said she did not have the energy for anger about that. She said she had used that energy to restore a building and hang her husband's paintings in the best light she knew how to make, and that this was what she intended to continue doing. She said Renee was welcome to look at the paintings for as long as she liked, because Wallace would have wanted people to look at them. She said the estate conversation was finished. She said it without cruelty, and without raising her voice, and without needing anything back from it. She said it the way a person says something they have been carrying for a while and have finally set down in the right place. Renee left after 20 minutes. June watched her walk through the gallery on the way out, stopping once more in front of a large landscape, a field in morning light, and looking at it for a moment before she continued to the door. She did not look back. June stood in the south wall light after she left and did not move for a while. She was not triumphant. She was not relieved. She was simply clear in the way that people become clear when something that has been unfinished for a long time is finally finished. She thought about the name on the back of every canvas. She thought about Wallace keeping things. She thought about what it meant to spend your life making something and addressing it to one person and trusting that they would find it. She went back to work. Gerard called 6 weeks later. Not that evening. 6 weeks, which was more honest than any earlier timing would have been. June let the phone ring twice before she answered, which was more honest still. He said he had been thinking about his hands on the table, about the moment they had pressed hard and then flattened and stayed flat. He said he had been sitting with that specific moment, honestly, for months, and it had not improved under honest examination, and he did not have an explanation for it that he was willing to offer as an excuse, because every explanation he had tried had collapsed when he looked at it without flinching. June listened. She said the door was open. She said he knew where Copperfield was. She said she had been keeping something for him, the last painting his father had ever worked on, unfinished in the top right corner, and that she thought he should come and get it when he was ready. He came the following month. He drove down on a Friday evening and arrived after dark, and stood in the gravel lot outside the cannery for a moment before he came in. June had left the door unlocked and the south wall lit because she had not known what time he would arrive, and she had not wanted him to find it dark. He came in quietly and stood in the main space for a long time before he said anything to anyone. He moved through the gallery the way a person moves through a place where they are encountering something for the first time that they should have known about much sooner. Slowly, reading every card beside each painting, looking at each work for longer than people usually look at things in a gallery, which is to say, long enough to actually see it. He looked at the light the way someone looks at light when they have finally stopped and paid attention to it and realized what they have been missing. He had been in this building before, not this building, but the space his father inhabited. He had walked past the back room door of the house on Clement Street thousands of times and never once knocked. He had known his father painted and had treated it the way families sometimes treat a parent's serious passion, as a hobby, a personal thing, something to be respected at a polite distance. He had never stood in front of his father's work like this. He had never understood it like this. He found June near the south wall and stood beside her without speaking. She did not say anything either. They stood in the light together for a while and let it be what it was. Two people who had been carrying something difficult toward each other for a long time, finally standing in the same place. Then he asked about the unfinished painting. June walked him to the shelf near the door where it sat in the morning light, and he picked it up and held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment and then turned it over. Her name was on the back, June. In his father's pencil, small and careful, written with the hand of someone marking something that belongs to someone else, something held in trust, he looked at his mother. She told him. She said his father had written her name on the back of every canvas he ever stored in that room. All 43. 50 years of work addressed to her without her knowing and without a word. She said she had thought about it for months, and the closest she had come to understanding it was this. His father spent his whole life making things he did not believe were good enough to show, but he also spent his whole life believing that she would know what to do with them if she ever found them. He had not sent her a letter. He had not left her a note. He had written her name on the back of every canvas and trusted that she would find them eventually, and that when she did, she would understand. She said she thought that was what love looked like when it did not know how to say itself out loud. It made things. It addressed them. It waited. Gerard held the unfinished painting in both hands and looked at the top right corner where his father's hand had simply stopped, the place where the light had not been finished yet, and he did not say anything for a long time. June let the silence be what it was, because some silences are the most honest thing available, and this was one of them. By spring, the cannery had become something Copperfield had not expected to have, and had not known it needed. A second exhibition was being planned, featuring work by regional artists who had nowhere else to show their work. 3 artists had already confirmed, and 2 more were considering. Philomena ran Saturday morning art classes for children in the South Wall light, 12 children the first Saturday, 19 the second, and she had started a waiting list by the 3rd week, which she regarded with the particular satisfaction of someone who has spent 32 years knowing that given the right conditions, children will always choose to make something. Otto was apprenticing with a stained-glass studio in a city 40 miles away through a placement Diana had arranged after watching him work for an afternoon and making a phone call. He came back to the cannery on weekends and worked on whatever needed doing, and was noticeably different from the boy June had found sleeping in the loading dock. Not in any dramatic way, but in the specific way that people change when they have been given something worth becoming. Petra's daughter had been born in February, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, named after her grandmother, and was sleeping in a basket near the documentation desk while Petra worked on the catalogue for the second exhibition. She had been offered a curatorial assistant position at the Arts Foundation and had accepted it, and was learning the work the same way she had learned everything else at the cannery, by showing up and paying attention and not waiting to be told she was ready. The cannery had become a place people came to, not just for the paintings, though they came for those too. They came because it was warm and specific, and the light through the south wall windows was the kind of light that made people slow down, and slowing down was something most people needed more of than they were getting. The unfinished painting remained on the shelf near the door where it caught the morning light every day. June had decided it was not for sale. She had decided this without deliberating much because the answer had been clear from the beginning. It was the beginning of everything. It belonged to the space that everything had been built around. Wallace had left it unfinished, and June had carried it to Copperfield and placed it where the light would find it every morning, and that was where it would stay. On a morning in late spring, June was at the south wall checking a frame that had been sitting slightly loose when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it before the second knock came. A woman stood on the step alone. One bag, early 70s, the expression June recognized completely because she had worn it herself, standing outside this same door on a cold Tuesday morning the previous autumn. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they never expected to need to be and is still deciding whether to feel ashamed of that or not. June stepped aside. She said, "Come in and I will show you the light." The woman came inside and stopped in the south wall light and looked up at the windows the way June had looked up at them on the first morning, and June watched her face change, the way faces change when they find something that was worth the journey. Wallace spent 50 years painting light. June spent 1 year letting it in. I want to ask you something before you go. How did this story make you feel? Whatever moved you, whatever stayed with you, whatever made you stop and think of someone you love, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments below. There is no answer too small. Tell me where you are watching from today. This community reaches further than I sometimes remember, and I want to know where all of you are. And one more thing. Think about the people in your life who spent years making something beautiful and never believed it was good enough to show, who kept it to themselves because doubt is quieter than sharing, and sharing felt like too much of a risk. If you know someone like that, tell them today that what they make matters. It is not too late to say it. Wallace ran out of time to hear it. Not everyone has to. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The next story is coming, and I believe it is going to stay with you.